I deactivated my husband's black card the second he landed in the Maldives with his 28-year-old assistant, but canceling his vacation was only the first domino. I was about to knock down I did not cry when the $15,000 charge hit the screen. I was standing in my kitchen in a t-shirt and sweatpants, coffee going cold on the counter, watching a notification bloom across my banking app like a bruise. Overwater Villa, 4 nights, Maldives. I stared at it for exactly 6 seconds. Then I opened the corporate card portal, found Damien's account, and hit deactivate. My hands did not shake. I want that on the record. I have replayed those 6 seconds more times than I can count. Not the charge itself, but the strange, almost clinical calm that settled over me while I looked at it. Overwater Villa, 4 nights, Maldives. $15,211 to be exact. Booked on a corporate card that existed for client dinners and airport lounges, not tropical vacations for 2. I remember noticing, absurdly, that the villa had a glass floor over the lagoon. I remember thinking, with total detachment, that I hoped the fish were nice to look at. I did not check whether it was a mistake. I did not text him, "Is this real?" the way a more hopeful version of me might have a year earlier. 7 years of marriage teaches you the difference between a mistake and a decision, and this had the shape of a decision, deliberate and expensive and made without me. I opened the corporate card portal instead, scrolled to Damien's profile, and clicked deactivate. A small red confirmation box popped up asking if I was sure. I clicked it twice just to be certain the system had registered it, the way you check a locked door. I set the phone down and looked at my son, who was leaning in the doorway with his backpack already on, waiting for me to drive him to school like it was any other Tuesday. He had his father's habit of watching a room before entering it fully, and I could see him doing it now, reading my face the way you'd read weather. "Should we relocate?" I asked him. Micah didn't even blink. He was 14, and he had his father's jaw and my eyes, and in that moment, he looked older than either of us. He smirked, the way he does when he already knows the answer to a question before it's finished. "Yep," he said. "Let's do it." I drove him to school that morning like nothing had happened, because that's what you do, apparently, even on the morning your marriage ends. He was quiet in the passenger seat, scrolling through something on his phone, and when we pulled up to the drop-off line, he didn't get out right away. "You're not surprised," I said. It wasn't a question. He looked at me for a long moment. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you," he said. I kept thinking maybe I was wrong. Then he got out of the car without another word, slung his backpack over one shoulder, and walked into the building like any other ordinary Tuesday. And I sat in the drop-off line for a full minute after he'd gone, gripping the steering wheel, before I put the car back in drive. I am Talia Marchetti. I built a design firm out of a spare bedroom in East Atlanta with $12,000 of freelance savings and a laptop that overheated if I ran more than 2 programs at once. That was 17 years ago. Today, Ashcroft & Vail Design has 41 employees, offices in Atlanta and Charlotte, and last year we billed $9.2 million. For 7 of those years, I was married to a man who let the entire city believe he was the one who built our life. We were married in June of 2010 in a small stone chapel outside Savannah, 40 guests, a reception in a converted rice mill that cost $11,000 we genuinely couldn't afford at the time. Micah was born 2 years later, in April of 2012, at Northside Hospital, 7 pounds 4 ounces, and I remember Damien crying in the delivery room in a way that felt, at the time, like the realest thing I'd ever seen him do. I started Ashcroft & Vail that same year, working from a card table in our first apartment while Micah napped, taking on any client who would have me, a dentist's waiting room here, a boutique hair salon there, building a portfolio one unglamorous project at a time. My first real contract in the fall of 2012 was a $4,000 refresh of a nail salon on Ponce de Leon Avenue, and I still remember the exact number because it felt, at the time, like more money than I would ever see again in one place. Damien was still an analyst then, 3 years from making VP, and he used to tell people at parties, back when the story still ran in a fairer direction, that his wife was building something real out of nothing. A line I liked hearing until I understood how easily it could be rewritten later to mean something else entirely. Damien Reyes worked at Kessler Bryant Group, an investment bank 2 blocks off Peachtree, and he wore it like a costume that fit a little too well. Bespoke Italian suits, 3 of them, each over $2,000, purchased from a tailor on West Paces Ferry Road who called Damien by his first name and me not at all. A silver Aston Martin he leased for $1,800 a month and never once mentioned was leased, letting new acquaintances assume, correctly calculated, that it was owned outright. Loud, confident opinions at every dinner party, delivered with the specific cadence of a man who has never once been interrupted mid-sentence in his life, about markets, about real estate, about which restaurants had lost it since some ownership change 3 years back that only he seemed to have tracked. Everyone at those parties assumed Damien was the architect of our success, and I was the pretty wife who picked out the throw pillows. The truth was uglier and much less romantic. Damien was a mediocre investor with an expensive taste for risk. In 2022, a leveraged bet against interest rate cuts collapsed and took $210,000 of our savings with it. I found out because a collections notice arrived at the house addressed to him, and when I asked him about it over dinner, he told me calmly that it was just a timing issue, a phrase he used so often over the years that I eventually understood it to mean something closer to catastrophe. He had a gift, genuinely a gift, for narrating disaster in the flattest possible terms, and I had, without meaning pertaining to, spent years training myself to hear timing issue and feel nothing at all. His credit was a minefield of maxed cards and a defaulted business loan from a wine import venture that lasted 11 months. I found out about most of it by accident, the way you find out your basement has flooded, by stepping in the water. There had been a warning, if I'm honest, a full year before Brielle, though I didn't recognize it as one at the time. Damien's previous assistant, a quiet, competent woman named Renata who had worked for him for 3 years, resigned abruptly in the fall of 2023 with no notice and no explanation, forfeiting a bonus she'd been counting on. I remember asking Damien what happened, and he'd waved it off, said she'd gotten weird, said something vague about boundaries that I let slide because I had a kitchen renovation to manage and 40 employees of my own to worry about. 2 years later, when Priya's investigator pulled Renata's old exit interview during discovery, it contained a single line I still think about. Mr. Reyes made the working relationship uncomfortable in ways I'd rather not detail. I hadn't asked enough questions then. That, I've come to understand, was the pattern of our entire marriage. Damien gave vague answers, and I filled in the vagueness with the most generous version of him I could construct, because constructing generous versions of Damien was, without my ever quite noticing, becoming my full-time unpaid job. I want to be precise about what the real foundation actually meant in practice, not just in principle. My income covered the mortgage, the private school tuition, the 2 vacations a year, the country club dues Damien insisted mattered for networking. His salary covered his suits and his car lease, and apparently, without my knowledge, a retainer with a divorce attorney. To protect what I had built, I did something that felt reasonable at the time, and now reads like the smartest and saddest decision of my life. I moved everything into my company's name, the house on Muirfield Lane, both cars, the investment accounts. Damien signed every document without reading a word of it, because signing things without reading them was the closest thing he had to a personality trait. He told me it made sense, that creditors couldn't touch what wasn't his, that it was temporary until he rebuilt. I believed him. I always believed him. That is, I think, the central fact of this story. Not that he lied, that I believed him so completely I stopped checking. I remember one night, maybe 8 months before the Maldives, lying in bed while Damien scrolled his phone beside me, and I'd asked him, half joking, whether he ever felt strange that everything technically belonged to me now. He'd laughed, kissed my shoulder, and said, "Why would I feel strange? We're a team, Tal. What's yours is ours." I remember how good that sentence felt to hear. I did not clock until much later that he had said ours and not mine, and that there was a version of that same sentence, spoken with slightly different intent, that could justify almost anything he might later decide to take. That trust died at 11:47 on a Thursday morning, when I opened the family travel app to check on Micah's spring trip, and instead found a booking confirmation for a resort in the Maldives. Departure that morning. Return in 5 days. Traveler 1, Damien Reyes. Traveler 2, Brielle Okafor. I knew the name. Brielle was Damien's assistant, 28 years old. Hired 14 months earlier out of a boutique staffing firm in Charleston, brought on, Damien had told me over dinner, because his last 2 assistants couldn't keep up with his calendar. I did not scream. I did not call him crying into the phone the way I imagine a lot of women do, and I don't judge them for it, because rage deserves somewhere to go. I finished the rest of my coffee, even though it had gone cold, and then I started cutting every wire that fed his lie. I revoked the corporate card. I changed the passwords on our joint accounts, the ones that were technically mine anyway. I logged him out of the shared family calendar. Within 11 minutes, a man who believed himself the master of his own empire was stranded on a private island with a woman he could no longer afford to impress. At 3:14 in the morning, my phone lit up the ceiling of my bedroom. I let it ring 4 times before I answered, and when I did, I didn't say hello. "Talia, what the hell is going on with the accounts?" Damien's voice had that particular strain men get when they're trying to sound authoritative and terrified at the same time. Behind him, I could hear the ocean, soft and enormous, and underneath that, Brielle's voice, sharp and annoyed, asking him what was wrong. Why weren't they eating? Was this going to ruin the trip? "That card belongs to my company," I said, "and my company doesn't fund networking retreats with 28-year-old executive assistants." There was a silence on the other end so complete I could hear the tide. "Please," he finally said, and his voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since his father's funeral. "Let me explain. It's not what it looks like. Enjoy the Maldives," I said, and I hung up, and then I blocked the number, and then I lay back down in the bed we had shared for 7 years and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up, feeling something I can only describe as unbearably clear. Here is the part I didn't know yet, the part that still undoes me a little when I think about it. Micah had known for a month. He told me later, sitting at our kitchen table, with his hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate he didn't drink, that he'd first seen Brielle's name pop up on his dad's phone while fixing a cracked screen protector back in April. Curiosity turned into something else. Over the following weeks, my 14-year-old son quietly built a file, a photo where Brielle's sunglasses reflected Damien's shirt, the same pale blue one hanging in our closet, a champagne toast where her wrist caught the light and there was his watch, the one engraved with our wedding date, wrapped around someone else's arm, location tags on Brielle's public account that matched almost to the hour, 3 of Damien's business trips to Nashville, Savannah, and Miami. He never showed me. He said he didn't know how, that he kept waiting for the right moment, that he was scared it would break something in me he couldn't fix. A 14-year-old boy carried that alone for a month to protect his mother, and when I finally understood the weight of what he'd been holding, I had to leave the kitchen and stand in the garage for 10 minutes before I could speak again. "Should we relocate?" he'd asked me that morning, and now I understood he wasn't asking a question. He was offering me an exit, the way you'd hand someone a rope. "Yep," I'd said. "Let's do it." By 8 that morning, I had 4 moving trucks in our driveway and a locksmith named Andre standing on the porch with a toolbox and an expression of profound professional discretion. I had called the moving company at 4 in the morning, the same hour Damien's plane was still somewhere over the Atlantic, and paid a rush fee of $1,100 without hesitating, because I had learned, over 17 years of watching him operate, that speed was the only advantage I had left before he could regroup and start calling lawyers of his own. 4 years earlier, terrified of creditors circling his failed wine venture, Damien had begged me on his knees, literally, in this same kitchen, to move everything into my name. He signed the deed transfer himself at a title company on Roswell Road on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2022. He signed the car titles. He signed away, without ever quite understanding what he was signing away, any legal claim to the life we had built. Legally, in the eyes of the state of Georgia, Damien Reyes was a tenant in my house with no lease and no name on any document that mattered. I had every right in the world to change the locks, so I did. His sister-in-law Dana arrived first, tires screeching into the driveway like she'd been notified by some family alarm system I didn't know existed. She got out of her car already yelling, something about how I was destroying a good man's reputation over a misunderstanding, how Damien had worked too hard to be humiliated like this, how I should think about what this would do to the family name. I turned my laptop around instead of answering her. I pulled up a spreadsheet I'd found buried in a shared cloud folder 2 hours earlier, a hidden ledger Damien had apparently kept to track discretionary spending he didn't want appearing on our joint statements. Spa weekend, $410, a Chanel bag, $3,800, and 6 separate transfers to Dana's personal account over the past year, totaling $9,200, each one labeled in Damien's own shorthand, D, thank you for covering. Dana's face went the color of the granite countertop behind her. She didn't ask what the transfers were for. She already knew, in the way you know something you've spent months pretending not to know. Her mouth opened, and for a second I thought she might try to explain it away, offer some story about a loan or a gift, but she didn't. She just looked at the screen, then at me, then at the moving truck idling in the driveway, and something in her face rearranged itself around a version of her brother-in-law she hadn't let herself see clearly until that exact moment. She turned around and left without another word, and her car was gone from the driveway before the second moving truck had even finished unloading its ramp. His mother, Corinne, arrived an hour later, moving with the unhurried confidence of a woman who has never once in her life been told no, and meant it. She demanded I hand over the keys immediately, called me with a small, cutting smile, a glorified decorator who got lucky marrying up. I didn't argue with her. I walked into the study, pulled the property deed from the fireproof safe, and handed it to her without a word. She read it twice. Her son's name was nowhere on it. Mine was, in bold, at the top. I watched something shift behind her eyes. Some structure she had built her entire understanding of our marriage on quietly collapse. She sat down on the bottom porch step, not because she wanted to, I think, but because her legs asked her to. He told me you two owned this together, she said mostly to herself. He told me that at Thanksgiving. He told a lot of people a lot of things, Corinne, I said, and I kept my voice even, because I didn't need her to feel what I felt. I only needed her to understand the facts. This house has been in my name alone since March of 2022. He signed the transfer himself. She looked up at me, and for just a moment, the practiced condescension she'd worn like armor for 7 years slipped, and underneath it was something closer to fear. What happens to him now? She asked. I told her honestly that I didn't know, and that it wasn't my job to know anymore. She didn't argue with that. She sat on the step a while longer, and then she called a car and left, and she didn't ask for the keys again. By nightfall, the house on Muirfield Lane was empty. Every stick of furniture gone into storage. Every suit, every pair of $500 loafers, every golf club, unfolded and unprotected, packed into 30 cardboard boxes and shipped at my expense directly to the address listed on Brielle's apartment lease, an address I'd found in that same hidden ledger, tucked under a line item labeled B, apt deposit. Damien landed back in Atlanta 2 days later, sunburned, humiliated, and functionally broke, since his personal accounts had been running on fumes for months, and the corporate card had been the only thing keeping the illusion alive. He drove straight to Muirfield Lane like a man walking toward the one fixed point in a spinning world. I wasn't there to see it myself, but a neighbor across the street, a retired judge named Mr. Cassidy, who had never much cared for Damien's habit of gunning his Aston Martin down a residential street at 7 in the morning, described it to me later with what I suspect was quiet satisfaction. Damien's key didn't work in the new locks, so he stood on the porch and pressed his face against the front window. Nothing looked back at him. No furniture, no art, no life. Just an empty house holding the shape of everything he thought was permanent. Floors he'd never once vacuumed. Walls he'd never once painted. Rooms he'd walked through for years, assuming, without ever quite saying it out loud, that they belonged to him because he lived in them. Brielle, who had ridden along out of some mixture of curiosity and self-interest, took one look through that glass, got back into her rental car, and left him standing alone on the porch in the fading light, his suitcase still packed with resort clothes he'd never wear again. His voice voicemails started an hour later. Panic first, apologizing, promising to fix things, then rage, calling me names I won't repeat here, then threats, that he'd sue me for every penny, that I'd regret this, that he still had friends at the bank who could make my business life very difficult. I listened to every single one, and then I forwarded them, word for word, to my attorney, a sharp, unbothered woman named Priya Anand, who had handled our prenup review 15 years earlier, and had apparently been waiting her whole career for a client to finally need her the way I needed her now. The next morning brought a different tactic entirely. Damien's brother Foster called me, his voice carefully gentle, the tone people use when they've been recruited. "Talia, I don't want to get in the middle of this," he said, which is what people say right before they get in the middle of something. But Damien's not doing well. He hasn't eaten. He said something last night that scared me. He let that sentence hang there, unfinished, clearly hoping I'd fill in the blank myself the way I'd been filling in Damien's blanks for 7 years. I asked him directly whether Damien had said anything specific about harming himself. Foster hedged, said, "Not exactly," said Damien was just really low. I told Foster I appreciated him calling, and that if he genuinely believed his brother was in danger, he should take him to an emergency room, not use it as a bargaining chip with me. Foster didn't call again. An hour after that, Damien himself texted, a long message about chest tightness and a doctor's appointment he claimed to have scheduled, ending with the line, "I just need you to unblock me for 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." I recognized the shape of it even through my worry, because I had watched him deploy smaller versions of the same move for years. A project deadline that became a crisis the moment I made plans without him. A headache that appeared whenever I raised something he didn't want to discuss. I called Priya instead of unblocking him. She arranged, through his own attorney, a wellness check that confirmed what I already suspected. He was fine. He was simply out of tools. He also tried, briefly, to rally our shared circle of friends, a group of 6 couples we'd vacationed with at Lake Burton every summer for a decade. He posted a vague, mournful message to a group text about going through something hard and hoping people would reserve judgment, clearly hoping sympathy would arrive before facts did. 2 of the wives called me directly instead, asking what had actually happened, and when I told them, plainly, without embellishment, laying out the dates and the dollar amounts the way I'd lay out a project timeline for a client, both of them left the group text within the hour. One of them, Renee, sent me a private message afterward that just said, "I always thought it was strange he never once mentioned your revenue numbers at dinner, only his." I hadn't noticed that pattern myself until she pointed it out, and once she had, I couldn't stop noticing it in every memory I turned over afterward. Somewhere in that same stretch of days, Damien tried a more procedural angle. He called Kessler Bryant's card services line and attempted to have the deactivation reversed, claiming a technical error. The bank, to its credit, required verification from the primary account holder, which was me, and the request died within the hour. He then tried calling my bank directly, pretending to be a joint account holder on an account that had never once carried his name, and was informed, politely but firmly, that no such account existed under his social security number. Priya later told me this attempt, on its own, would have been almost enough to establish a pattern of intent if we'd needed it. A man trying every available lever before landing on the one that actually worked, which was guilt. By the following afternoon, he'd shifted tactics again, this time trying Micah directly. A string of texts about how mom is destroying our family over a misunderstanding. And you'll understand when you're older that adult relationships are complicated. Micah, to his enormous credit, forwarded every message to me without responding to a single one and said only, "He's trying to make me pick a side." I told him he never had to pick anything. I meant it, and I have tried, in the months since, to make that promise cost Damien something, rather than cost Micah anything. Brielle didn't stay gone for long, which tells you something about what she actually wanted out of the arrangement. She'd left him standing on that porch, but a week later she was back, sitting across from him at a restaurant on Peachtree Street. According to a photo a mutual acquaintance sent me unprompted, captioned only, "Thought you should see this." Damien promised her a signing bonus tied to an upcoming promotion, something to smooth over the humiliation of the empty house, and she agreed, for a price, to play supportive girlfriend for a little while longer, an arrangement that told me everything I needed to know about how much of what I'd once mistaken for a great romance had ever actually been about romance at all. In the days between the empty house and the gala, I did not hear from Damien again, not because he'd given up, I would learn later, but because he was busy rehearsing a different version of events, one where he was the wronged party, a hardworking man blindsided by a vindictive wife. He apparently practiced that version on anyone who would listen, including, I found out, 2 junior analysts at Kessler Bryant, who later told a colleague they found the whole thing kind of unhinged, a phrase that made its way back to me secondhand and made me laugh out loud for the first time in 11 days. 2 nights later, I walked into the Kessler Bryant Group's annual gala at the Biltmore Ballroom in an emerald green dress I'd bought for myself, on my own card, holding court with 3 of my top clients near the bar. I felt, for the first time in weeks, entirely like myself. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I didn't see Damien come in. I felt the room shift first, the particular hush that happens when people recognize a spectacle before they fully understand it. He was wearing the suit he'd been photographed in on the plane home, still visibly wrinkled from 30 hours in a cardboard box, and Brielle was stiff on his arm in a red dress, smiling smiling the tight smile of someone doing a job she resented. He spotted me across the room and crossed it like a man on a mission, chest out, chin up, the exact posture he used to practice in front of the bathroom mirror before big presentations. I used to find that endearing. That night, I found it almost unbearably sad. "You think you won?" he said, low enough that only the people directly around us could hear, but loud enough that I understood he wanted an audience. "I'm about to be named managing director, Talia. I'll have more money in a year than you'll see in 5. I didn't answer him right away because the man standing beside me had gone very still, and I recognized that particular stillness. It was the stillness of someone listening carefully to a mistake being made in real time. Harrison DuPont turned around slowly. Harrison was the single largest private investor in Kessler Bryant Group's boutique hospitality fund, and he was, not coincidentally, also my biggest client. A man whose last 3 hotel properties I had designed from the studs up. A partnership worth over $40 million in contracts across 6 years. He looked Damien over, from his sweat-damp forehead down to the crushed hem of his jacket, with the unhurried thoroughness of a man conducting due diligence. "I don't shake hands," Harrison said, loud enough now for the tables nearest us to hear every word, "with men who wear unpressed suits and disrespect brilliant women in the same evening." Damien's face drained the color of the tablecloth behind him. And that was the exact moment I saw Preston Ambrose, the bank's CEO, walking toward us across the ballroom with a champagne flute in his hand and a smile on his face, utterly unaware that in the next 90 seconds, everything Damien Reyes had spent his career pretending to build was about to come apart in front of every single person in that room who mattered to him. I want to back up here, because the gala wasn't actually the moment everything changed. It was only the moment everyone else finally saw what I already knew. The real turning point happened the night before, in my kitchen, at 11 o'clock, when Micah slid a folder across the table and said, "Mom, I think there's something you need to see that isn't about Brielle." He'd been digging through Damien's old cloud backup, the one Damien forgot still synced automatically to our family iPad, because he was too disorganized to ever change a setting once it was set. Buried 3 folders deep past old tax documents and a scanned copy of his college diploma he liked to bring up unprompted at parties, was a file named simply Contingency. Inside it were 4 documents. A retainer agreement with a family law firm called Whitfield & Cross LLP, dated 14 months earlier. A draft post-nuptial agreement, unsigned, that would have entitled Damien to 40% of Ashcroft & Vale Design's valuation in the event of a divorce, on the grounds of significant unpaid contribution to the business's growth and reputation. A series of emails between Damien and a forensic accountant discussing how to characterize 17 years of my labor as a marital asset he was owed a piece of. And an email, dated 11 months earlier, to Corinne, that read, in full, "Don't say anything to Talia yet, but I'm working on protecting what's mine. This isn't about Brielle. This is bigger than that." I read that last line 4 times before it fully landed, and then I remembered something small, something I'd nearly forgotten entirely. Months earlier, cleaning out a drawer in the study, I'd found a business card for Whitfield & Cross tucked inside an old golf scorecard, and when I'd asked Damien about it, he'd said, without missing a beat, that a colleague had recommended them for a friend going through a rough divorce. I remember thinking nothing of it at the time, filing it away the way I filed away every small inconsistency he ever handed me, dressed up in a plausible enough story that questioning it felt paranoid rather than reasonable. I understood now that the friend going through a rough divorce had been him, in advance, on paper, well before either of us had said the word out loud. 14 months earlier was 2 months before Damien hired Brielle. Whatever this was, it started before her. She wasn't the cause of anything. She was a symptom, a convenient distraction dressed up as a scandal, layered over something far colder and far more deliberate that had been in motion for well over a year. My husband hadn't fallen into an affair out of weakness or loneliness or a midlife crisis. I could almost, in some private corner of my heart, have found a way to forgive. He had been building a legal case, quietly, methodically, with his mother's knowledge and a lawyer's help, to take a piece of the one thing in our marriage that had never actually been his. I sat with that for a long time after Micah went to bed. I thought about every conversation over the past year where Damien had casually asked about the business's valuation, dressed up as pride, as interest in my success. I thought about the way he'd started referring to Ashcroft & Vale as our company at exactly the same time, according to the email timestamps, that he'd signed the retainer agreement. I thought about how good he was at making calculation feel like love. That was, I realized, his real talent. Not banking, not investing, making a man's self-interest feel, from the inside, like devotion. The post-nuptial draft was never signed. I understood why the moment I checked the date against my own calendar. 14 months and 1 week earlier, I had turned down a request from Damien to combine our accounts more fully for tax efficiency, a request I now understood had nothing to do with taxes at all. He'd tried the honest route first, more or less, dressing coercion up as paperwork, and when I declined without knowing what I was declining, he pivoted. Brielle wasn't a replacement plan. She was, I think, simply what happened to a man who had already decided, somewhere deep down, that our marriage was a business relationship he intended to dissolve on the most favorable terms possible, and who no longer felt any particular obligation to be faithful while he waited for the paperwork to catch up to his intentions. That was the piece of information that recontextualized everything. Not the villa, not the the 28-year-old assistant with the reflective sunglasses. The retainer agreement, the unsigned draft, 11 months of quiet patient calculation, hidden inside a folder named for exactly what it was. So when Damien stood in front of me at that gala and said, "I'll have more money in a year than you'll ever see," I understood with total clarity that he wasn't bragging. He was telling me in his own oblivious way what he had actually been planning to take from me all along, and that the only thing that had gone wrong with his plan was that I found out before he could finish executing it. Preston Ambrose reached us just as Harrison finished his sentence about unpressed suits, and I watched the CEO's easy, practiced smile falter into something more calculating as he read the room. Preston was not a stupid man. He had built Kessler Bryant Group's reputation on discretion, and on protecting the firm from exactly this kind of public unraveling, and I could see him doing rapid math about which side of this scene would cost him less. "Damien," Preston said carefully, "perhaps we should step outside." "No," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, steady enough that 3 separate conversations at nearby tables went quiet. "Actually, Preston, since you're here, I think there's something you should know before you finalize that managing director promotion. I hadn't planned to do this in a ballroom. I want to be honest about that. I had planned to let Priya handle it through the proper legal channels, quietly, over months, the way these things are supposed to go. But something about watching Damien puff his chest out at me in front of 40 of the city's most influential people, after everything I now knew he'd been plotting for over a year, made the quiet, patient version of justice feel suddenly, unbearably insufficient. "Talia," Damien said, and for the first time that night, real fear entered his voice. "Don't." 14 months ago, I said, loud and clear and calm, the way you'd read a closing statement, my husband retained a divorce attorney and drafted a post-nuptial agreement entitling him to 40% of my company. He did this without telling me. He did this 2 months before he hired his current girlfriend as his assistant. He did this while telling his mother, in writing, that it was bigger than whatever came next. I have the documents, I have the emails, and I have 17 years of tax returns showing exactly whose income built the life he's currently trying to claim credit for in front of you. The ballroom had gone fully silent now, the kind of silence that has weight, that you can feel pressing against your ears. "That's a private family matter," Preston said, recovering some of his composure, glancing at the small cluster of Kessler Bryant board members who had drifted, moth-like, toward the commotion. "It became a professional matter," I said. "The moment he told me 30 seconds ago, in front of your entire senior leadership team, that his upcoming promotion would make him wealthier than his wife, whose company, by the way, has personally funded $40 million of Harrison's hospitality portfolio, a portfolio your bank has spent 3 years courting." Harrison, to his credit, didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply looked at Preston with the particular expression of a man reconsidering a business relationship in real time, and Preston understood exactly what that look cost. Preston glanced at the 2 board members hovering nearby, both of whom were now very deliberately studying their drinks, and I watched him make a decision that had nothing to do with fairness and everything to do with liability. "Damien," he said, "we'll discuss the promotion timeline internally. This isn't the venue." "This is exactly the venue," Damien shot back, and I think that was the moment his judgment fully abandoned him, since apparently my wife wants to turn my career into a public spectacle. "Your wife," Harrison said mildly, swirling his glass, "is the reason half the room came tonight, Damien. I'd be careful how you finish that sentence." Damien's mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out. "This is insane," he finally managed. "You're humiliating me over paperwork that never even went anywhere." "It didn't go anywhere," I said, "because I found it first." Brielle, who had been standing perfectly still through all of this, quietly slid her arm out from Damien's and took 1 step backward, then 2, the physical equivalent of someone reading the room's final verdict and deciding sensibly not to be standing next to the defendant when the gavel came down. "I need to go," she said to no one in particular, and she walked toward the coat check without looking back once, and I never saw her again in person, though Micah told me months later she'd left Kessler Bryant Group entirely and moved to Nashville. Damien stood there alone in the middle of the ballroom floor, in his wrinkled suit, in front of the CEO who now would not meet his eyes, in front of the investor who had just implied his hotel money might follow the woman he'd tried to legally dismantle, in front of his own mother, who I noticed for the first time was standing near the back of the room, having apparently come to watch her son's promotion be announced, and instead watching something else entirely unravel. "Talia," he said, quieter now, and something in his voice had finally lost all its performance. "Please, not like this. You had 14 months to talk to me like a person," I said. "You spent them talking to lawyers instead." I turned and walked back toward Harrison and my clients, and behind me, I heard Preston say something low and clipped to Damien about stepping outside, and I did not look back to see how the rest of that conversation went, because for the first time in longer than I could remember, I genuinely did not care. The consequences did not stay contained to that ballroom for long. Word travels fast in Atlanta's financial circles, faster still when it involves a public dressing down at the year's biggest gala, and by the following Monday, Damien had been quietly asked to take an indefinite leave of absence from Kessler Bryant Group while the firm reviewed matters unrelated to his professional conduct, which everyone in that industry understands to mean he was finished there in every way that counted. His mother called me 3 days after the gala, not to apologize exactly. Corinne was never built for apologies, but to ask, in a smaller voice than than I'd ever heard her use, whether the post-nuptial documents were real. I sent her copies. She was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she said something I did not expect. He told me it was about protecting the family. I didn't ask enough questions. It wasn't an apology, but it was close to an accounting. And from Corinne, that was closer to humility than I'd ever seen her come. Dana never spoke to me again, but she also never spoke to Damien again either, which I later learned was because the $9,000 in hush money transfers had, in fact, been payment for her silence about an earlier, brief involvement between Damien and a woman at his brother's law firm 2 years before Brielle, a betrayal I hadn't even known about until it surfaced during discovery. There is, apparently, always another layer, if you're willing to keep digging. Foster, to my genuine surprise, became something like an ally in the months that followed, though it took him a while to get there. 2 weeks after his failed phone call about Damien's chest pains, he showed up at my office. Not Damien's brother this time, but simply a man who looked tired and a little ashamed, and told me he'd found out about the retainer agreement and the post-nuptial draft the same week I had, and that he'd spent those 2 weeks trying to decide whether blood outweighed decency. It doesn't, he said finally, standing in my lobby under Harrison's hotel renderings. I should have known that faster than I did. He told me he'd confronted Damien about it directly, a conversation that had ended with Damien calling him a traitor and hanging up, and that their mother had spent a week trying to broker peace between them before giving up. He thinks loyalty means agreeing with him, Foster said. It never occurred to him it might mean telling him the truth. He testified eventually at Priya's request about a conversation Damien had had with him 18 months earlier, half joking about how some guys are smart enough to lawyer up before things go bad instead of after. It wasn't decisive, but it mattered to me that he chose to say it out loud instead of letting it stay comfortable and unspoken. There were business complications too, the kind nobody warns you about when a very public divorce becomes very public knowledge. One client, a hotel developer out of Charlotte who had signed with us 6 months before the gala, quietly paused a contract renewal, citing reputational uncertainty, corporate language for not wanting to be near a mess. I didn't chase him. I sent him our audited financials instead, unprompted, along with 3 years of on-time project delivery records, and let the work speak for itself. He signed the renewal 2 months later, apologizing in his own way by adding a second property to the scope. Harrison, for his part, never wavered once, and told me over lunch that spring that the gala had done more for his confidence in me than 5 years of client dinners ever had, because he'd watched me handle a public humiliation without losing my composure once. And in his business, he said, that was worth more than any portfolio. Damien's desperate final moves were exactly what you'd expect from a man who had spent a year and a half planning an exit strategy that had collapsed under him before he could deploy it. He filed for divorce first, hoping to control the narrative and the timeline, but Priya had already prepared for that possibility months earlier, and the existence of the unsigned post-nuptial draft, combined with the retainer agreement dated well before any claim of marital discord, made his 40% argument fall apart almost immediately in mediation. He tried briefly to argue that his professional guidance and industry contacts had materially contributed to the business's growth, an argument our accountant dismantled, with 17 years of client acquisition records showing Damien had referred exactly 2 clients to Ashcroft & Vale in the entire history of the company, both of whom I'd fired within a year for being difficult to work with. He tried once to show up at my office unannounced, 3 weeks after the gala, asking our receptionist, a sharp 23-year-old named Simone, whether he could just talk to Talia for 5 minutes. I watched the whole exchange on our lobby camera feed from my desk upstairs. I did not go down. He waited 11 minutes in our lobby, under a gallery wall of hotel renderings that Harrison's $40 million had made possible, and then he left. There was a moment, sometime in that stretch, quiet and unglamorous, that had nothing to do with lawyers or ledgers or ballrooms, when I found myself standing in Micah's doorway watching him do homework, and I thought about the man I married in a small chapel outside Savannah 17 years ago, the one who used to bring me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings before either of us had any money at all, before any of this, before the suits and the lease payments and the folder named contingency. That man had existed. I hadn't imagined him, and grieving the loss of him, the version of Damien I thought I'd married, turned out to be a separate and much harder task than simply being angry at the man he'd actually become. Anger, I learned, is loud and useful, and eventually exhausts itself. Grief for something that was never as real as you believed is quieter, and it comes back at strange hours, and you have to let it, or it finds worse ways to surface. It came back once unexpectedly, while I was unpacking a box of old photographs from storage, months after the gala. A picture of the 2 of us on the porch of a rented cabin in the mountains, maybe 4 years into the marriage, before Kessler Bryant, before Brielle, before any of it. Damien was laughing at something out of frame, his head tipped back, and I was looking at him the way you look at someone you have no doubts about. I sat on the floor of my closet with that photograph for a long time. I didn't cry exactly. I just let myself miss a man who, I now understood, might never have fully existed outside of my own willingness to believe in him. That is its own particular grief, missing someone you're not sure was ever real, and no legal victory, however satisfying, touches it at all. The legal proceedings dragged through the better part of a year. There were depositions and a forensic accounting of both the ledger and the business, and one particularly grueling afternoon where Damien Damien's attorney tried to argue that my emotional labor in supporting his career should be weighed against my legal ownership of the company, an argument the judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Okonkwo, dismissed within about 4 minutes, with a comment about the difference between marriage and a business partnership that I still think about sometimes. During Damien's own deposition, Priya asked him directly why he'd retained Whitfield and Cross 14 months before ever mentioning divorce to me. He hesitated, glanced at his attorney, and finally said he'd been exploring his options in case things didn't work out, a phrase so limp and evasive that even the court reporter, a woman who had presumably heard every excuse imaginable, paused for half a second before typing it. Priya asked whether exploring his options had included drafting a postnuptial agreement without my knowledge. He said he didn't recall the specifics. She placed the draft in front of him, his own signature block still empty at the bottom, and asked him to read the 40% figure aloud into the record. He did, in a voice about half the size of the one he'd used at the gala. There was also, unexpectedly, a phone call from Renata, the assistant who had resigned so abruptly 2 years before Brielle. She'd heard about the divorce through a mutual contact in the industry and called not out of malice, she said, but because she'd spent 2 years wondering if she should have said something sooner. She told me carefully that Damien had made her uncomfortable in ways that were never quite explicit enough to report. Comments about her appearance dressed as compliments, a hand that lingered too long on her shoulder during late nights at the office, and that she'd left rather than escalate it, afraid no one would believe a junior assistant over a rising executive. I thanked her and told her she didn't owe me anything, and she said quietly that she knew, but she wanted to say it anyway. Priya later used her account, with Renata's permission, to establish the pattern the judge had asked about during mediation. It wasn't the deciding factor in the settlement, but it closed a loop I hadn't even known was open, and it made something that had felt, for 2 years, like an isolated failure of judgment on Damien's part, look instead like exactly what it was, a pattern, worn smooth by repetition, that simply hadn't been interrupted yet. Renata and I have kept in touch since, in a small way, a coffee every few months, nothing dramatic. She works in-house now at a logistics company in Marietta, and says she sleeps better than she did the entire 3 years she worked for Damien. I believe her. I recognized something in the particular quality of her relief, because I'd started to feel a version of it myself, that specific looseness in the shoulders that comes from no longer scanning a room for someone else's mood before deciding how to feel about your own day. In the end, the house, the business, and the overwhelming majority of the marital assets remained mine, exactly as the paperwork Damien himself had signed 4 years earlier in a panic had always said they were. The final settlement conference took 11 minutes, a strange, anticlimactic bookend to a year of depositions and forensic accounting, and I remember feeling almost nothing when Judge Okonkwo read the terms into the record, just a kind of tired, quiet relief, the way you feel when a long fever finally breaks. He walked away with his car, half of a modest retirement account, and eventually a job at a smaller regional firm in Charlotte that Micah tells me pays roughly a third of what he used to make. He rents a 2-bedroom apartment now, off a stretch of highway in South Charlotte, the second bedroom furnished for Micah's visits with a bed frame Micah says still has the delivery plastic on one leg, 6 months in. I don't know if that detail means what I think it means, whether it's exhaustion or grief or simple financial strain, and I've decided it isn't mine to figure out anymore. That particular unfinished room belongs to Damien now, in every sense of the word. Custody wasn't entirely straightforward either, since Damien's attorney initially pushed for a 50-50 arrangement, arguing, without apparent irony, that Damien's flexible schedule following his leave from Kessler Bryant made him more available than me. Judge Okonkwo asked Micah, in a private chambers conversation neither Damien nor I were permitted to attend, what he actually wanted. I never learned exactly what he said in that room, and I've never asked him to tell me, but the resulting order gave me primary custody with generous, structured visitation, and Priya told me afterward, with the closest thing to warmth I ever saw from her, that judges rarely deviate that clearly from a 50-50 push unless a 14-year-old says something in that room that leaves very little room for interpretation. Micah stayed with me, obviously, though he sees his father every other weekend, a schedule Micah himself requested, and that I have never once tried to shrink. I have my own complicated feelings about Damien, but I have tried very hard, and I think mostly succeeded, at keeping those feelings from becoming my son's inheritance. Micah is not required to hate his father to love his mother. That was a rule I made for myself early on and have not broken. It has been 8 months since the gala. I still live on Muirfield Lane, though I've redone the kitchen, finally, in the warm walnut and brass I'd wanted for years, and never asked for because Damien preferred the cold marble look that photographed better for his colleagues. Micah picked the cabinet hardware himself, small brass pulls shaped like leaves, and every time I open a drawer I think about the fact that he was the one who handed me the first piece of proof, at 14 years old, when the adults around him were still too invested in their own comfort to look closely at anything. I run 5 miles most mornings now, a habit I picked up in the months when I couldn't sleep and needed somewhere to put the extra hours. I run the same loop every time, out past the reservoir and back along Muirfield, and somewhere around mile 3 I stopped thinking about Damien at all most days, which felt, when I first noticed it, like its own small kind of victory. I've started seeing a therapist, a calm, unhurried man named Dr. Ferris, not because I'm falling apart, but because I decided decided, somewhere around month 3 of the proceedings, that I didn't want to carry 17 years of misplaced trust into whatever came next without at least trying to understand how I'd carried it for so long in the first place. He asked me once, early on, what I thought I'd gotten out of the marriage that made 17 years of quiet doubt feel worth swallowing. I didn't have an answer for weeks. Eventually, I told him the truth, which was that being needed by someone who performed confidence so well had felt, for a long time, like a kind of safety. It took me most of a year to understand that safety and control aren't the same thing, and that I'd been mistaking one for the other since long before I ever knew Brielle's name. Ashcroft & Vail closed out last quarter at $11.1 million in revenue, our best in company history, and Harrison signed on for 2 more properties in the spring. We hired 6 new designers this year, and I promoted our first junior associate, a sharp 26-year-old named Adiz, who started 3 years ago answering phones, to lead designer on the Charlotte team, a decision that felt, in some small way, like paying forward the chance nobody gave me back when I was working off a card table. I still see Corinne every so often these days, mostly at Micah's school events, and we are polite to each other in the careful, exhausted way of 2 women who once loved the same man for very different reasons, and were both, in the end, wrong about him in different ways. She sent Micah a birthday card in the spring with a $100 bill folded inside, and a note that read, simply, "I'm proud of the man you're becoming, even when I wasn't proud of the men who raised him." I read that line more than once. I don't think she meant to include herself in it, but she did, whether she noticed or not. I think about the title of this story sometimes, the way I described it to a friend over dinner one night, back before I'd told anyone else. I deactivated my husband's black card. That's how it started. A small mechanical act, 11 minutes and a single click. People love to imagine revenge as something loud and cinematic, and mine did eventually become that in a ballroom, in front of 40 witnesses. But that isn't really where it began, and it isn't, I think, the part that mattered most. What mattered was smaller and quieter than that. It was a 14-year-old boy sliding a folder across a kitchen table because he trusted his mother enough to hand her a truth he knew would hurt. It was a woman finally understanding that being loved and being useful had, for longer than she wanted to admit, become the same thing in her own marriage, and deciding that she deserved to be the first, not the second. People ask me sometimes, the few friends who know the whole story, whether I regret how public it all became, the gala, the whispers that followed for months afterward at every industry dinner I attended. I don't, mostly, though. I've made peace with the fact that a quieter version of justice would have cost me less in the short term and taught me less in the long run. Watching Damien's face when Harrison refused to shake his hand taught me something about the difference between the life he'd performed for 7 years and the life he'd actually been building underneath it, a difference I'm not sure I would have fully understood if it had stayed private. I did not win everything that night in the Maldives, or in the ballroom, or in Judge Okonkwo's courtroom 7 months later. I lost 17 years of believing I understood the man I'd built a life with. I lost the version of my family I thought I was raising my son inside. Those losses are real, and I don't dress them up as anything else. But I kept what I built with my own hands, long before Damien Reyes ever walked into a room and decided it looked like something worth taking. And on the nights when the grief comes back quiet and uninvited, I remind myself that canceling his vacation was never really the ending of anything. It was only the first domino. Micah asked me recently, doing homework at the same kitchen table where he once slid a folder toward me and changed both our lives, whether I regretted marrying his father at all. I thought about it honestly before I answered, because he deserved honesty more than comfort. I told him no. I told him that man gave me him, and gave me 17 years of practice at building something real, and that neither of those things stopped being true just because the man himself turned out to be less than I believed. Everything that came down after that first small click on my banking app, I built myself, brick by brick, the same way I'd built everything else, alone, and then, slowly, not alone at all.